Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy. So Ken, when did you first become interested in aviation?
So I guess really when I was a teenager I joined the Air Training Corps down in Ilfracombe, North Devon. My brother was already in the Air Force as a navigator on Vulcans. My mother had been in the Air Force in World War II in Canberra as a parachute packer. And so I guess there'd been a little bit of an aviation influence in there from Mum a bit, but she was wartime only, and then my brother. So yeah, just decided I liked airplanes, started making plastic models, and it went from there.
So when did you actually join the RAF?
So I actually went for a scholarship. So in the sixth form you can go for a scholarship to go to university. So at that time in the early 70s the Air Force wanted all aircrew to be graduates. So a new program came in. So I applied for a scholarship in the sixth form, got the scholarship, then converted that into a university degree in 1972. And going aircrew, they said, study whatever you like. So I went for ancient history and archaeology. So you'd think not a great deal of use for a navigator, but their view was, if you're an engineer, you need an engineering degree. But aircrew, it was more about 3 years of growth and development of thinking. And actually we'll reference that archaeology bit when we come to talk about the PR9 operations later on.
So did you always want to be a nav?
Perversely I did, and actually when I went to the interviews at Biggin Hill, which is where the Officers and Aircrew Selection Centre was, and of course the two-wing master race tend to be the people dominating the interviews, and I remember the wing commander pilot said, I see you've applied to be a navigator, Ken, why is that? I went, well, my understanding is actually it's a more interesting role. You know, all the clever stuff is done by the navigator. He kind of harumphed a bit at that, and I thought, you know, Christ, I've blown it now. But the other guy with him was a nav, and he was kind of giggling, and I thought, well, maybe it'll be okay. And so, yes, I applied as a nav, maybe influenced a bit more by my brother as well, who was a nav. And so I'd heard more about that, and I didn't really necessarily want to go and fly the fighter jets particularly. I just wanted to go and fly airplanes.
Yeah. So did you have a type you wanted to go into at this point?
Actually, not really, because I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I applied, the Air Force was in a transition phase, so a lot of the new airplanes coming in, but I had no real desire to fly any particular type. I had a few I wanted to avoid, one being the Vulcan. Having heard stories from Howard about the Vulcan and having sat in them since then, I'm glad I avoided it. And the Shackleton, there was another one to avoid.
Oh, yes.
But I had no great desire of a particular airplane to go to, probably favouring more towards the Phantom and the Buccaneer, which are really the ones that were coming into volition then, really. And certainly when I got to nav school, that was very much the aim of most guys in nav school on the phase one, the group one flying, was to go Buck or Phantom.
Nice one. So can you talk us through your nav training, your basic nav training, and before you went to the front line?
Yes, I having done the officers training course at Cranwell, which is a 14-week course when I did it, you then go to Finningley, and all navigator students start with the same basic Domini flying. I was the first of the all-jet courses. 210 nav course was the first all-jet course. Up to that point, they'd flown the Varsity as their multi-engine airplane, but we were the first to do all Domini. So phase one was basically just medium and high level flying around, just learning basic navigation techniques, the shape of the earth, maps, all that kind of basic stuff, air plots still in those days as well. At the end of that first bit, you all then went to the phase one for the fast jet bit, which was jet provost. So you all then did a bunch of flying around in the JP at low level, and at the end of that, you were then decided whether you would be best suited for the low-level role, the Group 1 guys, fast jet role, or the kind of the trucky Nimrod bomber type role for the Group 2 guys. And they would then go and do a different course. Now that primarily came down to where the system thought you were best suited. Now, like all the way through your training, you had the ability to say, I would like to do X, but the Air Force would look at it and say, how many of X do I need? Is this guy capable of being X? Can I get a round peg in a round hole, or do I actually need all square pegs this month? So at the end of that, you get streamed. You get streamed either Group 1 or Group 2. Group 2 was all Domini flying, and they went to Hercs, Nimrods, Vulcans, all those kind of roles. And Group 1 was the fast jet stuff, but also the radar slots. So Vulcan radar, Victor radar, Shackleton radar all went through the Group 1 course, as did Canberra's, recce Canberra's. So you then went through another bunch of jet provost flying, including pairs and tactical formation stuff, another bunch of Domini flying, but that was all low-level radar work. And at the end of that, assuming you passed the course, you then got a posting. And you filled in what you wanted to go and do. And I would say probably of my course, we had 10 Group 1 navs. Probably 8 of those wanted Phantom or Buccaneer. I think I probably actually put Buccaneer down. I don't want to go air defense. So I think I put Buccaneer down. And then when their postings came out, mine came out as recce Canberra, which I didn't really know a huge amount at that time. But a bunch of guys said, oh, you're really lucky, that's great. And so that was how I got posted to recce Canberra's.
Wow, awesome. So what were your first thoughts of the Canberra?
Well, I knew a bit about the aeroplane, history-wise, but not a lot. My brother had flown Canberra's early on 115 Squadron at Watton, but then he went on to the Vulcan course after that. So I didn't know a lot about Canberra's from him. And I was posted initially to 13 Squadron at Malta on the PR7. And then because my wife was heavily pregnant, they wouldn't let us go. And so I was transferred instead to 39 Squadron at Whitton. And so I didn't know much about the Canberra until that point. Then I started doing a bit more research on the airplane. I wasn't at that stage a great aviation historian. The aviation history bit really came after I arrived on the squadron and was made the squadron historian, because I had a degree in ancient history. I'm the squadron historian. And from that point on, I started talking to all the old boys and girls and got really interested in the history of the Air Force and then the history of the Canberra, which is a phenomenal history.
It is. There's so many marks of the Canberra, but can you briefly share with our viewers some of the marks? And because obviously we stood there with the PR9, but there's so many. Can you just briefly explain?
Yeah, and the PR9, the one behind us here, looks very different to all the others. Just looking at the canopy above, there's only 2 RAF Canberras that have that view of canopy, the BI-8, which was a bomber interdictor, and the PR9. But the PR9 was unique in its canopy arrangement, which we'll talk about a bit later on. So, I mean, the Canberra was designed in 1944 by Teddy Petter, so designed in World War II.
Crazy, isn't it?
And ended up leaving Royal Air Force Service in 2006, and NASA in the States still fly 3.
Oh, they're still going?
Now, they're very, very different to this one, but they are still essentially a Canberra. So, phenomenal history, and the Royal Air Force had nearly 70 squadrons of Canberras. So, obviously, it started initially in the bomber role, so it was designed to be basically the replacement for the Lancaster, Lincoln, the jet bombers, and the Mosquito. So it's designed to go higher and faster, albeit with a smaller bomb load. Originally designed to have a radar bomb sight to overcome the problems of accuracy, and that didn't work. So it ended up being a visual bomber with a glass nose, just like a Lancaster or a Lincoln, dropping exactly the same 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs. But the primary role was to introduce Bomber Command to the jet age. Bomber Command didn't want the airplane. It was an interim step, because it's a small airplane, not enough people in it, not enough bombs, before the proper bombers, the V-bombers, came into play. But it converted Bomber Command from Lincolns and Mosquitoes to the jet age, and flying at 50,000 feet instead of 25,000 feet, and flying at Mach 0.8 versus, 2/3 of that. So that was the primary role of the Canberra when it first came in. But the airframe was so adaptable, it very quickly got turned into a reconnaissance airplane, initially as the Canberra PR3. And then later on as the PR7, then eventually the PR9. So multiple variants and marks of the Canberra have been used, and it performed such a wide range of roles, from straight bomber to interdictor ground attack, reconnaissance, target towing, electronic warfare. It's done almost everything.
Yeah, it's an incredible aircraft, but could you tell our viewers what the role of a PR9 nav was?
Yeah, so all of the navigators in the PR force, and the early PR Canberra squadrons had 3 navigators on board. Later on 2, and of course in the PR9 there's only seats for 2. So the role of the navigator in any of the PR airplanes is primarily navigation, getting from A to B and finding the right place, and then managing the cameras. So all the camera controls in terms of setting the cameras up to do what you want, picking the right camera, is all in the front. Now, the pilot has a switch to actually fire the camera, but that's about all he can do. Everything else is in the front. So if I select the wrong camera, or I set the wrong settings on the camera, he can press a button, it'll work, but it won't get the result you actually want. And then the latter days of the PR9, then of course you're doing self-defense of the airplane as well. So the self-defense suite is also embedded in the front of the airplane.
So let's talk about some of your ground training in the PR9. What was that like for you?
So the ground training, it's actually quite humorous. I did the initial Canberra OCU when I did it was at Marham, 231 OCU was at Marham, and all aircrew go through the OCU for the Canberra. And it was primitive in the extreme. We're now used to looking at computers and everything else, but the simulator, for example, for the Canberra, which is B2 simulation at that time, was a little wooden box with a few instruments on the front of it. And if you wanted to do a radar, a fix, say off the TACAN, it didn't work. You actually passed a piece of paper under a slot in the cubicle to the instructor who's the other side, saying, I'd like a fix from this beacon at this time. He'd then make up a number and pass that back at the appropriate time, and that would be your radar. That would be your fix from the TACAN system. Wow. And then you'd make that actually apply to the map you were going to go and do. So to say it was primitive was a bit of an understatement. And then when you arrive on the OCU for the PR9, we had our own conversion flight. And that was primarily to convert crews to the airplane, because the OCU at Marham did no reconnaissance training, no camera training. It was simply primarily teaching the pilot to fly what is quite a dangerous asymmetric airplane. And so that was the primary focus. You as a navigator were really just sitting there as ballast and learning a bit about the airplane at the OCU. On the conversion flight, you were now starting to learn all about reconnaissance and all about identifying targets as well. Because obviously you're not only taking a photograph of the target, you've got to also do a visual description of the target, again, a bit more later on.
Mm-hmm. So in the early sims, were you enclosed like you see behind us, or was it all open, or was it like...
No, it's literally a box. It's literally like you walked into a box that's about 6 foot square, and you sit by a desk with a few instruments in front of you, and you sit there and you look forward, and that's it. And the other side of the box, other side of the wall, is the instructor. He can't see you, but you're just passing bits of paper back and forward. It's quite amazing. But even when I was an instructor at Finningley later on, the simulator at Finningley, which is probably, the building was maybe 20 times the size of this room here, that was computerized, but all the banks of computers there were 32K combined. So again, the phone you're holding in your hand now, is 1,000,000 times more powerful than the entire Navigator simulator at Finningley.
That's absolutely crazy. So can you talk us through your first flight and some of the flying training you did?
Yeah, so obviously the other big difference for you when you sit in this one is, it is, as you'll see when we open the nose in a minute, a bit of a black hole of Calcutta. And people, when they look and they come visit the airplane here at West Raynham, they often say, is it claustrophobic and how did you do that? And two things to that. Firstly is, at this time frame, 1960s, 70s, most navigators sat in black holes. And certainly when this was designed, all navigators sat in black holes. Whether it's a Vulcan, a Victor, a Shackleton, you're in a black hole. So this was no different to those. Until the things like the Phantom and the Buccaneer came in for navigators, excluding night fighters like Meteors, you always sat in the dark, normally facing backwards. So at least here, you're sitting in the dark facing forward, so there's one advantage. So yes, people say it's a bit of a black hole. But the other thing is you're very busy. So you're busy all the time, either navigating or running the cameras, writing visual reports, doing in-flight reporting on the radio. You don't really have time to think about the fact that you're stuck in a black hole.
So we now have the nose open. So can you tell us what it was like on your first flight sitting right there?
To be honest, I can't remember a huge amount about the first flight particularly, but it's a bit strange when you first sit in there, and then when the nose closes, it closes with a big clang, a bit like a cell door. Not that I've been in a cell, so I'm not, I've seen films of cell doors closing, but you kind of think, and it goes dark. And the little window you can see on the left-hand side there are known as day-night indicators. I'll talk about what they're actually for a bit later on, but essentially it's pretty much like that. There's not a lot of light in there once you close that door. And then the table sits on your knees and your nav bag sitting down the side of the seat. You are a bit constrained. And unlike all the other Canberras, you can't get up and walk around, and you can't go and have a chat to the pilot and tap him on the shoulder, because he climbs up his ladder, sits in his place, I sit in the nose, and that's it. You don't see each other again till you get out. It's a unique arrangement for the PR Canberra, for the PR9. And the reason why the canopy is offset, when you look up now at the canopy, it's only offset to the left-hand side because it was minimum change from all the other Canberras. And in all the other Canberras, you climb through a door on the right, and you then, as a pilot, move across to the left-hand side and sit under the left-hand side of the canopy. Well, once you decide you're not going to use that door anymore, and you move the canopy across to the left, then of course it looks offset. People always think it was done for clever tactical reasons, done for keep it as cheap as possible reasons. So when Shorts designed this in Northern Ireland, they were told a minimum change to be made to the aeroplane.
So we're going to have a detailed look later on, but can you tell us some about some of the systems for the nav and the cameras that were on the PR9 in your time?
So in my period, I arrived on the squadron in 1977. This particular airplane here, XH135, I flew that 15 times on the squadron. amongst my 1,000 hours of PR Canberra flying. And so really we're talking there about that late 70s, early 80s period of fit for the airplane. When it went through one of its first transitions of kit in it, essentially in the front, you've got the front set of instruments on navigation, the left-hand side is all the camera controls, and the right-hand side is all the communications, in essence, in breaking it down. And so for you, your primary role obviously was to maintain the navigation system as accurate as you could, and then obviously with your map on your table, navigate from A to B. You're then using the cameras appropriate to the sortie. So when I was on the squadron in the late 70s, we had two primary roles. We had a tactical low-level role, and we had 3 cine cameras for that, F95 cine cameras, one in the port, one starboard and one in the nose, and there's a little round window you can see, and we'll look at that in a moment. And you run those at either 4 or 8 frames a second. And they're basically, we've used those at 100 feet, 200 feet, that sort of height. And so if you're flying past a tank or a group of tanks or troops, that's what you use. You're flying past a bridge or anything else that's a tactical target, that's what you use for the photograph. We tended to put those targets down the left-hand side of the airplane only because the pilot has a better view down the left. So we tend to use the port F95 more than any of the other two because it gave him a better view as you pass the target. If we got the target in the right position for the camera, and you ideally want the target, say it's a bridge, so a lateral bridge, you want that bridge 1/3 of the way up the frame in the film. If he gets it 1/3 of the way up the frame, then I will see it in my window. So as we flash past the target, I look at the target, he looks at the target, and I write down a visual report on what I've seen, then I ask him what he saw.
Right.
So when we're tasked for that target, we'll be told if there are any key elements of information. So against the bridge, they might say, we really want to know what the structure of the bridge is, so we need to do weapon to target matching. So if you want the weapon to go bang effectively and choose the right weapon, you need to know the structure of the target. So they might say the primary purpose here is structure. They might say, we want to know for any alternate crossings. So if we drop this bridge, can they get across the river in some other way within a mile or two? So depending on what the key tactical data requirement is, will be what we'll actually write down. And you have to learn what things look like. So, electronics is another thing. So you go flashing past a mast, what kind of antenna are on there? What direction do they face? Are they weather covered? How many are there? And you're doing all this in 5-10 seconds as you flash past a target and write it down. And you do lots of training on the ground. Recce squadrons had a very intensive ground training system. So you learn how to identify these things very, very quickly. So you could write it down. And you tended to fly with the same pilot all the time, which meant you could share the information more readily. You understood how the other person worked. Constituted crews was still the case on Tornado for me as well in my day. So probably 80% of my trips in this were flown with the same constituted pilot in that period. I changed pilots 3 times in my 5 years, but same pilot. So if we go past a bridge, then we will agree that he will look at certain parts of it and I will look at other parts of it. That way, we shouldn't miss anything. A guy called Mike Rondo, who's a well-known aviation artist, was one of our pilots, and I flew with Mike. And Mike would actually draw a picture of the target as well. So when you landed at the end of the sortie, you normally did 5 or 6 of these targets in a trip. When you landed, the film was taken away, and I'll show you a camera magazine in a moment. The film was taken away and developed. You then go to talk with the PIs, the photo interpreters, and before you can look at the target, they ask you for your visual report form, so they can compare what you said about it to what the film actually shows. So every time you fly, you're being evaluated. Mike would hand in a drawing of the target as well, being an artist. His drawing was normally brilliant. And so one thing I really liked about the recce role was it wasn't pretending you dropped bombs on something. You actually came back with the result or not. So it's continually proving you can actually do the role. Yep. And that's the tactical role. Of course, flashing around at a couple hundred feet is actually quite good fun as well.
So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the PR9?
The strength of the airplane, and where it came in to start with, was the height. The airplane was designed to operate at above 50,000 feet. And when it first came in, there was nothing else up there. And no fighters could get up there. No missiles could get up there. And so when the airplane came into service in 1958-59, the PR9, it was safe at that height. Then, of course, in the early 1960s, we had the shoot down of the U-2, and so people said, well, maybe it's not quite so safe after all. Having said that, there were not many people that could get up there. And even in the latter days, in the early 80s, if you rang a fighter squadron up and said, would you like a high-level practice target? And they'd go, yeah, that's great. 40,000 feet? No, 60. they weren't that happy, and they would be somewhat busy, wouldn't come and want to play. So the airplane had the ability to fly phenomenally high. I've been to 62,000 feet in one of these. You can't turn, there's no air up there, and so you're kind of being very gentle with it. One of my colleagues claims to have been to 68,000 feet in a PR9, which is pretty good going. Routinely, we'd fly at 50, 55,000 feet as a matter of course.
Great stuff. So what was your first frontline squadron with the PR9?
39. So 39 was the only PR9 squadron, so that was it, and they were based at Whitton. So having arrived on the squadron, it was great. You know, it was a very well-established squadron. I was the first tourist, and I guess probably 3 people on the squadron were first tourists. They didn't tend to send first tourists to PR squadrons, PR9s, and certainly there was only one first tourist pilot in my time on the squadron. Because of the nature of the job and the responsibilities with it as well. And we were a global squadron, and we unlike Tornadoes, where you would take everyone to the same place every day, we'd have an airplane in Hong Kong, one in Belize, a couple in Kenya doing survey, a couple in Norway in detachment. We would only be together twice a year for our tactical wartime deployments in Norway. That's it. The rest of the time, the squadron would be split up all over the place, either flying in the UK, just doing what they call trip of the day, practice flying, or doing survey flying, or doing some other kind of flying. Now we mentioned there the tactical cameras, but the strength of the airplane really was more about the rest of the airspace you've got from 1,000 feet to 60,000 feet. And so the array of cameras we had in the airplane then was impressive. And so you'd have a whole bunch of cameras called the F96, and they might have up to a 48-inch focal length camera. And you'd have fans of 4, split pairs, all sorts of variations on the camera depending on what the role you were going to go and do. And then if you're going to go do night work, initially we had the F97 for night flashing, but I didn't do much night flashing because in the late 70s we brought in an infrared line scan pod. And so we did most of our night work was IR. And again, talk more about that in a moment. And then we had a thing called the F49 Mark IV, it's a survey camera. And so if you look at a 50,000 scale map in the UK, all of that is based on photographs taken by PR cameras. Wow. Because we could fly 50,000 scale. So here's a photograph, it is exactly 50,000 scale. If you wanted 25,000 scale, we would either change the lens or change the flying height to give you 25,000 scale. And so, although we've only got these 2 day-night indicators in the airplane, these windows, what we have is a periscope. We have a viewfinder. So the orange thing we'll look at in a minute in there actually looks through a prism under the nose. And whilst you can use that at low level, the primary purpose is medium level and high level, because when you put it vertically, there are 2 tram lines down the center. So you navigate the airplane very accurately by keeping your line on the map down the center of those tram lines. So you're working very closely with the pilot, who's got some indicators in the top end there that show him a pre-exposure light, i.e. the camera's about to fire, the exposure light, and you can only move the airplane after the exposure light has gone. Because if he moves the airplane when it's about to expose, of course you'll throw the photograph out. So what we're trying to do is get what they call stereoscopic images. So you want a 60% fore and aft overlap, because then when you look at those 2 images together with a stereo viewer, it's 3D. Whether that's tactical camera or high-level camera, you get that 3D view. So you're trying to make sure there are no holes in the imaging and to make sure that you get that good stereo overlap for the guys as well.
And I have to ask, who's in charge of the heating and air conditioning?
Yeah, well, there's one of the great points with this. So one of the things with this is you can imagine now that I'm sitting in what essentially is a freezer, and at 50,000 feet, it's minus 54 centigrade. Ooh. Boy Wonder is sitting in what essentially is a greenhouse that is 50,000 feet closer to the sun. Wow, yeah. So he is warm and I am cold, and he has the heater. Now I can wear an air ventilator suit, which I can blow cold or hot air on me, but we didn't tend to wear that very much unless you're in the Mediterranean or in a hot climate where you wanted the cold air component to it. In the earlier Canberras, you had electric socks. We didn't have electric socks in this one, but they were quite good to keep your feet warm with an electric sock.
Wow. So what was crew coordination like? Was it just essentials and you do your job, or were you constantly communicating? Again,
one of the advantages of constituted crew, and the same is true of any airplane with constituted crews, is the amount of chatter between the cockpits goes down massively if you're flying with the same person all the time. because you know what that person is likely to do. You're not trying to do their job. You have confidence that they're going to do their job. So you talk only at the times you need to talk. You'll also have a bit of banter saying, you know, there's a nice castle over there, or whatever else. But essentially, you talk when you need to talk, but there's not a great deal of chatter. If you needed to, and obviously in the target run, there's a lot more, because on the target run, then you've got to make absolutely sure you're in the right place, you've got the right camera selected, and then when you go past the target, then, you know, I'll initially do my writing down of what I saw. Then as soon as we're clear of the target area, I'll say to him, okay, what did you see? And then normally within 2 or 3 minutes of the target, you're meant to pass back the key elements of information.
Right.
So the bits that the task has asked you for, target number, TOT, and then the 3 or 4 key data points are meant to be passed back as quick as possible. On the grounds that you might not get back. Now, we had no real-time relay in my day on the aeroplane. The latter part of the PR9, they had real-time data link. So here, you had to bring the film back. But if you didn't come back, at least those key words you sent back might be of some use to the boys and girls on the ground.
So Ken, did you have any emergencies in the PR9?
Actually, in my time on the squadron, I was quite lucky. We didn't have, you know, really anything go wrong. We had, I think, a couple of engine failures, but they're not that bad. In fact, with engine failure, the Canberra has a very bad rep for asymmetric. Because of the widely spread engines, then it means that if you lose an engine, there's an endeavour by the airplane to roll. And if that happens at low level, of course, you're going to crash unless you can correct it very quickly. And so as navigators, you're normally fat, dumb and happy, assuming that the pilot, you know, can do this quite easily. The mistake you make as a nav is flying in the front of the T4. And I flew, my pilot, John Clemens, was the QFI, the qualified flying instructor. And so I went up in the T4 with him in the right-hand seat and he said, oh, have a go at asymmetric. It's only at that point you realise how difficult it actually is. Up to that point, I was fat, dumb and happy to think it was easy. Now I decided this was not maybe a safe thing to go and do. So other than that, no real emergencies in the PR9. A few bird strikes and things, and all birds smell of fried chicken when they get on the engine. Every bird smells the same. But no significant key damage for that. Tornado, different. I had a few incidents of tornado, but not in this.
So was the PR9 the right aircraft for the job at the time when you were flying it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a phenomenal airplane. We had 2 of the airplanes had a thing called System 3, which was basically a U2 camera for long-range oblique photography. Only 2 carried it. And so the idea with that being you could then take photographs a long way away. So we had a photograph in the squadron crew room of Big Ben, the clock tower in London. And we'd stand visitors there and say, look, you can read the time, what a great photo. And they go, so what? You can read the time. Yes, but it's taken from the Isle of Wight. 55,000 feet over the Isle of Wight, and that's how good the imaging was. And so there are a number of standard places around the world where we did regular, looking sideways, shall we say. How did the RAFs see, from other types, see the Canberra? Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I remember when I left the squadron in 1982, because they were taking the squadron down to half size, and they decided that they didn't need this many Canberras, the Canberra was going to go out of service in 5 years' time. We applied in 1980 for self-defense systems, the BOSPOD, because it's got the hard points on the wings, which you never had on most of the Canberras, but this one kept the hard points from the BI-8. And so we could actually put BOSPODs on the wings. We had a radar warning receiver fitted in the late 70s, but that was it. And we were told, no, there's no money, it's an old airplane, it's going out of service by 1985, 86, forget it. So I end up on tornadoes. I end up going then in the early 90s with a recce tornado squadron, 2 squadron out to the Gulf. And of course we had the TER system, which is optimized for very, very low level night and bad weather. And we're sitting in a debrief one day, and we have F-14 TARPS imagery, and we have our imagery. And our imagery was a handheld camcorder, because we had to fly at 10, 20,000 feet. So our OC Rick had gone down to the local market and bought a couple of camcorders. And so we're kind of leaning over the side like World War I, taking fix on a camcorder. And this general comes in, he says, no, this is ridiculous. Or Air Vice Marshal came in, he said, this is crazy. How come the F-14s can do this and we can't? And I said to the guy, look, if you want proper imagery, bring a PR9 out.
Right.
And he went, we can't bring an old airplane. It'd be embarrassing. This was 1991. By 2006, the Americans in particular couldn't get enough of this airplane. This particular one, 135, was the last Canberra over Afghanistan. Oh, wow. First over Afghanistan and the last. The Michelin marks aren't on it anymore, but the Gulf II Michelin marks are still on the jet. So the imagery was phenomenal. By that stage, it's not the imagery I had with my F-96 and things. Now you're into very advanced sensors and a real-time data link to the ground. and a bunch of self-defense systems. So all the things we'd asked for back in the early 80s, and were told you couldn't have, the jet's too old, by the early 2000s, they were there. When they dropped the squadron in 2006, there were a lot of people saying, you can't replace this. And there is stuff. The Air Force had nothing after it gone.
Because the platform's solid, obviously.
So like all airplanes, it's all about the platform. If you can keep updating the platform's capability with sensors and weapons, it continues to be valid. Same with Tornado. When I first started flying Tornado in 1982 on 9 Squadron, it was pretty much an electric Vulcan. We were dropping dumb 1,000-pound bombs with a slightly smarter system and some ability to defend yourself. By the time the airplane I left in 1994, we had LGBs and the tile pod. By the time that the aircraft went out of service in 2019, it was 10 times more capable. Jet's the same, the engine's the same, airframe's the same. It's the sensors and weapons that are giving you that massive change in capability.
Absolutely. And did you ever interact with the U-2 crews?
We did. We didn't talk a lot about it, but we did, because of the nature of what we did, we would interact with the guys at Alconbury and in Cyprus.
Thanks. So can you share a few memorable stories from your time on PR9? I'm sure you've got plenty.
That's one thing about all the Canberra bit is just full of stories. We had an event here yesterday with about 40 odd guys, ground crew and air crew along. And so the stories were flowing all over the place, ground crew and air crew alike. So, I always say when I give people talks on this airplane, that one of the headlines that could have been in 1980 around the world was RAF spy plane shot down over Vietnam. I go, what? Yeah, because I've been in Hong Kong on detachment with the aircraft and my pilot. We were coming out of Hong Kong, and as you leave Hong Kong, you make one turn to parallel the coast of Vietnam. And so we'd made that turn, and about half an hour later, I wake up and I go, oh, hey, John, I've been asleep. All I can hear is from the back, we've both been asleep. So if we'd fallen asleep before the turn, we'd have gone over Vietnam at 45,000 feet, probably been shot down, and of course, it wouldn't have been two idiots fell asleep in the airplane, it was RAF spying on Vietnam. A headline that never was, but could have been.
Any more stories you can share?
Yeah, there are lots of stories that come around with this airplane in general, because the Canberra had so many good stories. You can see behind us that where the nose opens, that you then have to step out of the airplane down onto the ground. We had one flight commander of the squadron who thought we weren't doing it in a good way. He thought we could be better in the way we stepped out of the airplane. It didn't look neat. So one of the guys actually put a dinner jacket on under his flying suit, and when they came back after the sortie, he'd arranged for the ground crew to wear white overalls. And you wear white overalls to meet VIPs, and to come up with a small set of steps. And we'd also arranged for this flight commander to be near that aircraft at the time. So he's in his car sitting by that, and he sees these guys walking out with these white overalls and a pair of steps. And the guy in the nose, it wasn't me, it was somebody else, had actually taken his flying suit off, and as they put the steps down and opened the nose, he walked down the steps with his eagle and he went, "Is that better?"
That's brilliant.
But the best one of all, I think, is that the PR9 was the only RAF Canberra to have an autopilot.
Ah.
And because you have the hole down the right-hand side where the entranceway normally was, the pilot can put in the autopilot, push the fuel tray to one side, and climb down the hole. Mm. So when you're flying over France, on your flight plan, you put a word called embellish, and embellish means come get me. And I'm open to be intercepted. So you're flying at 50,000 feet over France, and the French will always come and have a go at you. So when you know the French guy is coming up after you, the Mirage is coming up to you, he puts the autopilot in and straps, climbs down the hole. So when the Mirage appears on the wing, the airplane is empty. It's a Marie Celeste Canberra. So he goes across to the other wing and looks. Again, it's empty. And I can see him, I'm looking at the window at this guy. So I say to the pilot, "About now." So he leans up from the hole, waves, and then goes back down the hole again. And of course, there are legions and legions of stories that go on with the PR9.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard some great stories, maybe you can share a few, where Lightnings have tried to turn with the Canberra and it just outturns them.
Yeah, well, because it's a big wing. So for us, and two things, the engine is big as well. So the normal Canberra engine was 6,500 pounds for us, 7,500 for some of the others. This is 11,250. It's a Lightning engine without reheat. It's an Avon 206. Yeah. So you've got a lot of power. We only ever take off with 90% power, never 100% power. And that's partly to do with safety with asymmetric loss and things. So you've got a lot of power there, and the big wing, if you get slower down to 240 knots, will outturn almost anything. So again, if we went and did some playtime with lightnings, then yes, you would be able to slow down and outturn the lightning. When he worked it out, he'd still get you eventually, but he wouldn't get you easily.
So Ken, how would you sum up the PR9?
I think it's just a fantastic British designed aeroplane that did a phenomenal role for such a long period of time. This particular airplane here, 135, entered service in 1959 and served on all three PR9 squadrons, 58, 13 and 39, and one PRU, which is really 39 by any other name, from 1959 through to 2006. So the Queen certainly got her money's worth out of this aeroplane. We're currently trying to record all the sorties the airplane flew, and we can only get that by going back to chaps that flew it and getting their logbook records. We're currently up to about 1,200 sorties, but there's probably 9,000 sorties for it. And when you start looking through that and looking at the range of things it did, whether it's off in Belize doing something with the looking at across the border at the Guatemalans, it's been involved in every aircraft accident has had this thing going around photographing that accident. When you had the Moors murderers, the PR9s were up there taking photographs to help the police try to find potential buried places. Wow. When the IRLS came in, we were often called out by the police to look for missing persons. So you're looking for a hotspot. So a body, when it decomposes, gets hotter and hotter. So if you fly over that suspected area, then potentially you will find the remains of that. Now, we always said to the police, don't send us to a sheep field because there's too many hot bits in a sheep field. But so all sorts of things. The Iranian embassy siege, we were on standby to fly over the embassy in London during the Iranian embassy siege. In the end, the SS didn't call it in. The reason for that was this airplane is totally silent from the front. So the massive noise would only occur once you got over the building. Yeah. And we were clear to fly at 50 feet over London. Whoa. Which was great. Did a bit of practice on that. It was quite good fun.
Yeah, just before we wrap up, actually, how many theatres is the PR9 served in?
Everywhere. There's nowhere the PR9 has not been. It was, say, used by the three squadrons, primarily 13 and 39, and eventually all the PR9s went to 39 and 13 re-equipped with the PR7. So the PR7 and the PR9 in particular have been used across the Air Force in all theatres, only based in the UK and in the Middle East, not based in the Far East, but involved in all theatres. So things like Vietnamese boat people, PR9s go out to watch that. Things like the Al-Shabaab taking all the schoolgirls, we send a PR9 out to start helping look in the area. So the ability of the aeroplane to cover large areas of ground is what you need with it. And many countries then use it for map making surveys. So you'll go and spend 3 weeks in Kenya or 2 weeks in Denmark or wherever, doing vertical photographs for maps.
So you must have had some great dates.
Oh yeah, yeah, and they are. I mean, that was part of the thing with this. We said that people say about claustrophobia, you went nice places and you did interesting things. Yeah. Every day was different. One day you'd be at 100 feet flying around fields in Norway. The next week you'd be in Kenya doing map making. Then you'd be off to Hong Kong. Then you might go to Belize. So the range of things. It was challenging for the wives because you're away a lot. Yeah. And you're away quite often at short notice with priority one tasking and things. But for you, and certainly as a first tourist, and actually it didn't help me when I got to Tornado because I got so used to that independent bit of 2 chaps taking an airplane away for 3 weeks that when you get to Tornado, you can't get to the bathroom without the rest of the squadron. It came as a bit of a challenge.
So how many hours did you get on the aircraft?
Just under 1,000.